Hello and welcome to History on Tape, where we interview historians about their work and ideas. I'm Clare Richardson, and my guest today is a historian of the modern Middle East and director of the Zentrum Moderner Orient, or Center for Modern Oriental Studies Research Institute here in Berlin. She's also a professor of Islamic Studies at the Free University, and her work focuses on modern Middle Eastern historiography, Arab networks in the Indian Ocean realm, and the urban history of 19th and 20th century Jeddah. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Ulrike Freitag. Thanks for being here. So today I want to focus on two topics that are relevant today, both to domestic politics here in Germany and as well as internationally. But first, to get an idea of the history behind them and see how we can learn some lessons from the past to apply to our modern day thinking. So you've edited the book City in the Ottoman Empire, published in 2011. The book looks at Muslim refugees fleeing Southeast European provinces of the Ottoman Empire, East Europeans fleeing anti-Semitism, laborers, urbanization, pilgrims turned settlers. It looks in part at attempts by local governments to control the movement and settlement of people. So my first question for you today is, what sort of administrative and political structures did the Ottomans have to do this?
Well, there was an interesting change in the Ottoman Empire, in a sense, as part of the transformation from an empire into a nation state, which meant that the Ottoman Empire introduced nationality laws, it introduced passport laws, it introduced vagrancy laws, trying to control movement, trying to control people, being afraid, very much like the German state is these days, being very much afraid of people with dual or triple nationality, which of course in an imperial, much more messy context, you had a lot of. And this is not just an Ottoman endeavor, it's very much part of the European efforts you could also see in the British Empire and the French Empire and the Austrian Empire and the Russian Empire. And the Ottomans were very much part of this, in a sense, international effort at restructuring and thereby also rethinking what their own empire and its relation to its nation, to a potential nation state, should be or could be. And in many cases you've seen then a transformation from a more imperial setup to a more colonial setup, which focuses very much on the differences between people in the center and people in the colonies. And there's a huge debate right now going on to what extent the Ottomans also did this. And the argument is usually that it was much more complicated to a large extent because the Ottomans simply did not have as much infrastructural power as the British or the French, for example, had.
So what was the time frame for this transformation? Was it something where they put up borders overnight and instituted passport controls, or was it over the course of years or decades?
No, it's a transformation which took decades, which started in the, you could say, 1850s, and in a sense wasn't finished by the end of the First World War, when of course the Ottoman Empire disappeared. So it's a really long process. In part it's an echo of measures taken by European powers. In parts it's a reaction to, for example, colonial interference, and quite a lot of it is also related to the Muslim pilgrimage, to the Hajj, where the question was then, what do you do with destitute Indian pilgrims who want to stay on simply because they don't have the means to go back, but who then go around begging in the streets of Mecca and Jeddah, and neither a pretty sight nor do they have any sustenance, and can you oblige the British to take them back? For that you have to have legal measures in place. So it's a combination of different factors really which led to this long transformation.
So generally, where did migrants settle? Migrants coming to, say, modern day Turkey?
Well, they settled in different places. I mean, you have a lot of refugees, for example, from the Russian Empire, who mainly went to Istanbul simply because it was the largest city. It was quite close to the Russian Empire. You had quite a huge Greek Orthodox population there already. It seemed a good place to find work. It was fairly European. You have refugees, you have, for example, quite a large number of Indians who came to settle in the Hejaz, benefiting in a sense from the pilgrimage, but also benefiting, for example, from the possibility to escape British influence and thereby be able to organize anti-British actions in India. So you have a completely different kind of community there. You have at the end of the 19th century, a large community of West Africans who marched all the way across Africa to get to, notably again, the Hijaz, in order to escape the French colonial effort, which was pushing across the Sahara towards the Atlantic Ocean in sub-Saharan Africa. So you have very many different movements, and not all of them obviously settling in modern-day Turkey, but also in the other parts of what used to be the Ottoman Empire.
And did you see these different diasporas settle in pockets, or was it the case that they were meeting in a central city and having communication with one another? And to what extent did they integrate with the local culture?
Well, I guess you have very different cases, and it's very difficult to generalize. You have sometimes huge groups of people who move and who then obviously settle also where they find already compatriots who know their language, who perhaps help them find accommodation, who help them find the first petty jobs. And then it depends very much on whether they start to intermarry with others, to what extent they are successful in their migration, to what extent they're perhaps also being sent back. For example, you have quite a number, this is one of the articles in the book if I remember correctly, you have quite a number of people working in the entertainment industry who were perhaps not necessarily settling, but actually moving around from through different port cities, notably of the Ottoman Empire, wherever they thought they could, in a sense, sell their services. These people would not necessarily want to even integrate, whereas others might want to settle permanently. Or the kind of people I'm looking at, it's those who settle in the Hijaz and Jeddah, in Mecca, to some extent in Medina. They very often actually intermarried with the local population and in a sense became so Arabized that they wouldn't really be distinguishable from the local population. But then there are particular groups who are either very large, like people from southern Yemen, or who, you know, have their distinct dress, like the Indians and again the people from southern Yemen, that they formed actually separate communities and also tended to intermarry. And this answers also your second question, to what extent did the various migrant communities communicate with each other? Well, it depends totally. You really cannot generalize. It depends on whether they were all located in the same place. It depends on whether they had professional interactions. For example, the merchant community of a merchant and migratory trading city such as Jeddah was composed of people of, 30, 40, 50 nationalities or original nationalities, many of whom had become Ottoman by virtue of having settled in the Ottoman Empire for 5 years or more, which entitled you to Ottoman nationality. And thereby they would have interacted by virtue of their trade, not necessarily meaning that they would trade with everybody equally. They might have their own merchant networks which were basically ethnically organized, but then for certain goods they would interact with merchants from other communities and other networks.
Yeah, there would have to be some sort of exchange at the ports.
Exactly. So I think you really have to look at the different cases and see how
on a case-by-case basis how it plays out. And so what were the labor laws like with regard to migrant workers? Was it welcoming? Were people working under the table? Was it something that was encouraged, or?
Well, there weren't that many labor laws. I mean, this is really something which starts fairly late in the Ottoman Empire, and then it starts mainly in the big cities. It starts for, people working in the ports, people working in major infrastructure projects, who then also can start to organize by way of trade unions.
So you say that's a more recent development, that they had laws on the books?
Well, that is a development of the very late Ottoman Empire. Okay. I think for most people, the major issue was getting into the Ottoman Empire. And then it was usually the guilds who regulated entry into the various professions. For example, the guilds would meet very often in a rather informal way. They wouldn't have guild houses as they have in many European countries, but they would meet regularly. They had guild masters, and they would decide whether somebody who was a newcomer fulfilled the necessary requirements and whether they actually had space for yet another building master to join the building masters of a particular place.
So breaking into these professions was really dependent.
But you had this kind of quality control through the various guilds and professions. Right. So the easiest was, in a sense, the kind of irregular, low-skill labor, which you had, with porters, with sailors, with, many of the sort of petty jobs, carrying water, cleaning the streets. That were professions which weren't really controlled at all.
Mm. So a lot of these questions are still relevant to modern governments trying to resettle displaced peoples. Have they learned any lessons from the Ottoman Empire? Would it serve as a model or a good example?
Well, it's difficult to use an empire as a model for what nowadays all claim to be nation states. I think certainly a lesson that could be learned is that there's no real need to fear immigrants per se, because mostly, and this is also true for the Ottoman Empire, where you also had the occasional people who wanted to stir up trouble, be it anti-colonial trouble outside, which could cause the Ottomans embarrassment in their external policies, or perhaps even within the Ottoman Empire, but mostly migrants were concerned to basically find a living and find a kind of decent life. And very often it was unclear whether somebody would stay or move back or move onwards. Much in the way it is nowadays when people from sub-Saharan Africa, for example, enter Europe. If they find jobs in Libya, as they used to do, or in Algeria, they might even stay there. If they find jobs in Spain, it's fine. If they don't, they might want to move on to Norway. It really depends very much also on opportunities, on borders being open or closed, on the labor situation, etc.
So let's talk about migration to Germany specifically. There's been Turkish communities from the Gastarbeiter, guest worker program. There's been a first wave of a Syrian diaspora, and of course the recent wave of people coming from Syria and Iraq in the last year or two, as well as from Africa. And from the outside, when people look at Germany, and a lot of the media coverage internationally focuses on worries about Germany's ability to handle settling refugees and people coming to the country. And I think a lot of that turns on this idea that there isn't a big history of migration to Germany, and that a homogenous society doesn't have the experience to handle immigration. Do you think that's a valid perception from abroad? Is it something that's blindly looking, that's missing a historical reference point?
Well, it's not just the perception from abroad, it's also an inner German perception, which in a sense also dominates much of our debates. I think what we tend to forget is the huge wave, for example, of Polish workers coming to Germany in the late 19th century when the coal and steel industry started to develop. We tend to miss out on the migrations followed by the end of the two world wars, where there was a huge absorption and a huge exchange also of populations. We tend to forget the Russians of supposedly German origin who came in the 80s and 90s, where again, there was a lot of talk about that. We didn't just hire Turkish guest workers. Before that, we had Italians, Portuguese and Spanish who were actually regarded with a similar lack of trust as Turkish workers were regarded thereafter. So this whole argument about the role of Islam in distinguishing between good and bad immigrants, or potentially problematic and unproblematic immigrants, is again something which is a more recent development. So in a sense, I think Germany actually has quite a lot of experience. Of course, it's acting under, nowadays at least, under very different conditions than the Ottoman Empire did. Germany is a very regulated state. And whereas in the Ottoman Empire it was very much up to the migrants to find a job, find a place to stay, etc., etc. And if they didn't, they slept rough. Germany is trying to avoid exactly that, and in a sense is perhaps even over-organizing, over-regulating this whole process of trying to settle migrants. But perhaps I'm a bit too skeptical here.
So, you mentioned earlier Spanish migrants to Germany and the like. Do you think that attitudes toward them have changed nowadays? Do you think there's still a certain sense that they are an outsider and a certain fear in the same way that people think about Muslim immigrants coming, or is it something that has, is it a group of people that have integrated into, or at least that have been accepted by Germans as being a part of modern day society?
I think they've mostly been completely accepted. And I think that has very much to do also with the integration of the European Union and the perception of whoever is part of the European Union is a European and therefore is more or less, one of us. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing about the Turks is that initially they were recruited as Turks. They weren't recruited as Muslims, and they weren't categorized as Muslims. If you look at the literature 15 years ago, we had a Turkish problem in the same sense as we used to have an Italian problem or a Portuguese or Spanish problem, always in quotation marks, obviously. Yeah. And the fact that they're Muslim is really something which has cropped up much more after September 11th, I think. Which has also popped up in the context, obviously, of the whole negotiations between Turkey and the European Union about a possible accession, where suddenly the identitarian argument was put forward. Mm-hmm. So I see it much more as a more recent kind of classification.
You mentioned Turkish-German relations, which I also wanted to ask you about these days, as you're seeing possibly a low point in relations in the last couple of decades, as Ankara wants visa-free travel for its citizens to come to the European Union, and in exchange the EU has struck a migrant deal to try and get Turkey's help in stopping people from coming into Europe. But what was the relationship like historically between, say, the German Empire and pre-war Ottoman Empire?
Well, there was quite a close relationship between the Ottoman Empire and Germany on a number of different levels. There was quite a lot of German investment in the Ottoman Empire, and one of the most remarkable objects of this investment was the railways, the Baghdad Bahn and to some extent also the Hijaz Bahn.
Could you clarify what that is?
These are railways connecting, in a sense, they would always say Berlin or Vienna with eventually Baghdad and potentially Kuwait, or then the Hijaz Railway connecting Damascus with Medina. They never got quite to Mecca. Something which was mostly, the latter one was mostly financed by Ottomans themselves, but German engineers were quite important in actually building it. And this, of course, tallies with railway projects also by other imperial powers. The French were quite active building railways in the Levant. The British were active. It's one of these things. It's like building canals. It's like, these were projects in a sense to open up also the economy
to open up trade routes for
particular countries. To exploit them or also to encourage trade, both of them actually, and to provide an outlet for capital investment, of course, and the export then of steel, for example, for the railways, the export of engines, etc., etc. So it's it was part of this whole process of an imperial way of globalizing the world economy, as we would call it these days. This was one level. The other level was that Germany was quite active in supporting the Ottomans in building up their army. Again, it's not just the Germans who did this. The British were very active in building up the Ottoman fleet. I always forget whether it was the French or the Italians who were building up the gendarmerie. And the Ottomans had purposely divided the different parts of the armed forces between different imperial powers in order to avoid too much influence of any one of them.
In the sense that the support they were getting from each European country, that their own army would be divided into different factions supported by different European countries?
Well, no, on the contrary, that not one European power would actually be able to influence all armed forces in the Ottoman Empire. And to some extent, the alliance during the First World War between the Ottomans and the German Empire was a bit, I'm not saying a historical accident, because the Ottomans, or quite a number of leading Ottomans, liked the Germans because they did not seem to foster as many imperial ambitions as some of the other European powers, in the Ottoman Empire at least. But then it's not as if the Ottoman leadership was unified in wishing an alliance with Germany during the First World War. So there were negotiations also with France and with Britain. And in a sense, it's a question of internal Ottoman power relations as much as external relations that they ended up having this alliance with Germany. It could also have gone another way.
The counterfactual history would have been interesting to see as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's move away from Turkey and talk a little bit about Syria. You got your PhD in 20th century Syrian historiography, is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
So before the modern day civil war, what is the history of Syrian migration, say, in the 1900s?
Well, that's mostly migration from the countryside to the cities. Very often it
Within
was
Syria.
within Syria or within Bilad al-Sham, which means that people from southern Syria might well have gone to Amman Amman wasn't such a big city then, but might well have gone to other Ottoman centers as well, which might lie outside the borders of present-day Syria. But you had this migration, which often was a seasonal migration, and which very often was also a first step of migration to America, which basically means the Americas, and which very often led people to go to Southern or Latin America.
Yeah, there's a big
Syrian
diaspora.
You have a huge diaspora of so-called Turcos or Turks in many countries of South America.
Turcos that are
and
actually
very
Syrians.
often these Turcos are Lebanese or are Syrians, and very often people who come actually from the mountainous areas, because these were the poorest areas, and therefore people wanted to migrate most. And if you take the larger notion of Syria, you also find very many Lebanese who already then migrated, for example, to Western Africa, in a sense following the French expansion there, and then becoming very active in trade. So you can find nice Lebanese restaurants in very obscure Cameroonian towns, for example, these days. And you have fairly huge communities of Lebanese traders in many port cities in West Africa. So these are the major places. Of course, you also had Syrians, for example, serving not just in the Ottoman army but also in the Ottoman bureaucracy. You would find Syrians going to Istanbul. You find Syrians going to Yemen, serving in the imperial Ottoman administration, for example, and settling there later on as the first administrators in the independent Yemeni governments. So in a sense it was the empire, but it was also, if you went beyond the empire, it was very often the Americas, at least as a goal, and then in Marseille they might end up on a ship going somewhere else.
Right. And to Europe, was there much migration?
There were some people coming to study in Europe, but it wasn't a major destination of migration. You had a couple of people also coming to Europe who were political activists. For example, some of the early Arab nationalists went notably to London and Paris. But these are not huge numbers. And then you have, of course, in the interwar period and also after the Second World War, you have quite a number of people who come to study, and then as a result of their studies, perhaps they got married and they settled here. So you have people since the 1950s or 60s who've basically become, Syrian German doctors. Very often it's doctors, but also other professionals.
Yeah. And so for the people going to the Americas, was the primary reason for leaving Syria economic, or was it political?
Yes. Yes.
It was looking for work.
Yeah. And it was very much also a flight from the Ottoman draft, because for the military draft, because very often it was unclear for how long people actually had to serve in the military. And therefore it was very unattractive. To some extent perhaps comparable to what's happening in Eritrea these days, where again military service can last basically any number of years, and young people don't really know what their future might be once they enter the military.
So before the Civil War that started 5 years ago, had there been anything that you would see in history to suggest that this moment would come? Had there been tensions brewing for a long time that a historian would have seen before the Arab Spring were going to lead to something like the Syrian Civil War? it's hard to look back now, perhaps, with the
it's
benefit of
very
hindsight. What
difficult. I mean, when I went to Syria in 1984, this was 2 years after what was known as the Hama massacres. There had been between basically the late 1970s and 1982, more or less, there had been not quite a civil war, but a major, you could call it uprising, but it was perhaps revolt. I don't know how you would actually call it. There had been a large number of armed incidents between the Syrian army, basically, and notably the Muslim Brothers, a religiously organized Sunni Muslim group, who were very bloodily suppressed, ending in the bombardment of a Syrian town, namely Hama, which the old city of which was pretty much still destroyed when I first saw it, and which was rebuilt afterwards. So in a sense, you could see that the regime was ready to suppress any opposition in a very, very brutal way. So that is one thing. The other thing is that the leading ruling clan in Syria comes from a religious minority, from the Alawites, who have been officially recognized as being Shiites, but are not recognized by all Sunnis as actually being Muslims. There's a debate about this. There were official fatwa or religious opinions issued that yes, they were proper Muslims, but this is a bit of a matter of dispute. The important thing is that this minority has tended to favor a number of other minorities. In a sense, this goes back to the French times, when the French recruited notably Muslim origin minorities, also the Druze, the Ismailis, and the Alawites, coming from poor mountainous areas again, and being minorities, and therefore potentially particularly loyal to the French regime, recruited them into the army. And that continued after independence, because Sunni Muslims as well as others were able to buy themselves out of the army. So many Syrians went to the army, but also many others didn't, and those who were particularly interested in careers in the army were those who came from a military tradition and those who came from poor areas. And these were disproportionately many minorities, notably Alawis and Druze.
Would that help explain that Syria was one of the last countries where the Arab Spring really caught on?
Certainly the regime brutality is one of the explanatory factors. I think if you say, well, where are the roots of what we now would interpret perhaps as a sectarian conflict, I would go back to this kind of particular constellation in the military, which also allows, in a sense, a recruitment into the opposition along religious lines, and which also perhaps explains why many Christians are much more cautious in criticizing the Assad regime, because they're afraid of a Sunni majority which might discriminate against them.
Because they found protection from the Alawite minority. Yeah.
But I would still be very hesitant to say that anybody could see this coming. I know a few people who told me afterwards, well, we've seen this coming. I think most people who were there at my time, which is basically from the mid-80s to the mid-90s that I traveled a lot to Syria, would have said, well, there was a trend of people becoming more religious, perhaps outwardly also. There was a trend perhaps of different religious groups keeping more distance from each other, but most people wouldn't have expected. I think not, but I'm not a political scientist who's really following events at very close range.
Right. But the historical perspective is really interesting as well, and not one that you hear so often, I'd say, in the narrative. So you also edited this lovely book next to us, Urban Violence in the Middle East, and in the foreword you talk a little bit about the Arab Spring unfolding, and that your coverage in this book aimed to move away from this idea that there was political deadlock in that region, that it was always going to be a stalemate between sectarian tensions. Looking back now, and that you wrote this book just as the Arab Spring was catching on. Looking back now, would you write the same foreword?
I think we would probably write a fairly similar foreword. We would still argue that even where tensions can be very much classified along sectarian lines, there are usually also other factors underlying it. I think the most prominent example for this in the book is the chapter on Aleppo and attacks on the Christians, massacres of the Christians in Aleppo in the 1850s, which I think can be very well explained and is very well explained by our author, a Syrian Christian himself, by looking not just at economic factors, but also looking at the spatial development of the city of Aleppo. And I think one of our intentions was to take the spatial turn seriously, to look at how spaces were used by different groups in different conflicts, in different constellations, and how that influenced or did not influence the way in which urban tensions played out. And we were also quite intent on looking at taking violence as a normal part, in a sense, of everyday life. I think, even if we look at European history, we can see that there is potentially always quite a lot of violence in societies, which is if the state has a monopoly on power and can exercise it effectively, which can be suppressed quite a lot. But even if you look at, reports from Europe, from any European city, almost on a daily basis, you'll find that violence comes out. And so the question is, when does, and I'm not talking about petty crime, but when does organized violence come out, and when can it actually be suppressed through other mechanisms of societal negotiation? So the book is not just about violent events, it's also about what has to happen for an event to become violent.
So in the case of 19th century Aleppo, what was it about the urban setup that led to this?
Well, there was quite a lot of tension, notably surrounding one particular suburb, which had grown rather rapidly, which was inhabited almost exclusively by Christians, and which had been to some extent protected not just by the imperial powers. The consuls at that period had quite a lot of influence in the protection of religious minorities. That's based on contracts which had been negotiated with the Ottoman Empire, but also by the Ottoman government itself. And a conflict which had a lot to do also with a conflict between the wider population and the Ottoman government was then, in a sense, translated into an attack onto this particular Christian quarter. And it's interesting that here, as well as in Damascus 1860, where we also have a major massacre, that those Christians who were well integrated with the Muslim quarters and perhaps lived in the Muslim quarters, because you didn't have to live in a Christian or in a Muslim quarter, you could live in many different places, that these people were usually protected. So this is cutting very short a rather complicated story.
Complicated. You'll have to read the book to get the full background. So how has the Arab Spring influenced research about the Middle East in your department here in particular? Has there been more interest?
There's certainly a lot of public interest. We've had a couple of projects dealing with the modern Middle East. I would say, in general, research has become much more complicated. First of all, because you have actually nowadays civil wars in places where we used to do research, like Libya, like Yemen, like Syria. Quite a number of places have become actual no-go zones. In others, such as Egypt, there has been a very marked authoritarian turn.
Right.
So I would say overall it has become much more difficult to do research in the contemporary Middle East than it used to be some 15 years ago.
Right. You've got all these places that you would previously be able to do research that are now no-go zones, as you say.
Absolutely.
You mentioned Egypt, and just recently there was the case of an Italian PhD student who was found murdered with evidence of torture, and some allege that the Egyptian government may have had a hand in his death. So with an environment like that, one where researchers feel that perhaps the government even could act out violently against them, what's your approach to doing research in those regions? Is there an alternative to going there? Are you looking more into archives, or are you working more closely with people who are still there to try and export information rather than visiting it yourself?
Well, in a sense, I guess it's a mixed approach. I mean, we have researchers who still go to Egypt. We are very careful about, for example, at the university, we are very careful about sending students to do research in Egypt, and certainly particularly careful if they would want to work on contemporary politically sensitive issues.
Topics.
If somebody wants to work on the Mamluk history of whatever and intends to go to some libraries in Cairo, we certainly still would make sure that this person had local contacts, that this person was registered with the embassy. Mm-hmm. We always discuss with all our researchers here the potential risks mm-hmm. of their studies. We've rejected in the past research projects when people were applying at ZMO to do particular projects. We've rejected projects which required lengthy research in Yemen, for example. Mm-hmm. So there are simply quite a number of things we can't do anymore. Mm-hmm. What are we doing instead? Well, there are a couple of other countries where you can still do research. We have a mix of anthropologists and historians. The historians are to some extent better off, but they still would have needed to go, for example, to Yemen, which has very rich local archives, and state archives, which are simply inaccessible. The same holds true for Libya. To some extent, obviously, we try to activate our local networks in order to access particular information. For example, I have a Libyan PhD student who used to work at the university there. She still has friends there. And if there is the possibility to travel across Tripoli, they have been willing and so friendly to go to the archives for her and send her stuff over. Wow. Well, yeah, and in a sense you have to
work with what you've got.
To work with what you've got, to improvise. I think for some projects you can also rethink the project design. I know quite a number of PhD students, for example, have started to do much more work on the social media. For example, somebody working on the Yemen is an example that comes to mind.
Would you say certain countries have benefited from this refocusing of resources?
That depends on whether the countries would consider
more attention to be beneficial.
Increased foreign research as a benefit, or rather as a
nuisance.
As a nuisance,
right.
Yeah.
Are there certain countries getting more, more
definitely.
resources for historical research, though?
Well, the problem is that the resources from German institutions very, very often go mainly to German researchers who then go there and do research. I mean, we are currently in a very nice Volkswagen Foundation project, which actually funds research groups in 3 Middle Eastern countries, plus a small coordinating group here. And the problem there is, for example, that although all 3 of these countries are not in civil wars, the obstacles to cooperate with the local universities are so high that it's almost impossible. It works in Morocco, it was complicated, but it works. It doesn't work in Egypt, where the university, in a sense, is afraid of cooperating with a foreign organization,
power,
which could be some kind of spying agency, although it's very clear who the funder is, what the project is, who the people involved are, so it has to go through private contracts, which themselves are delicate, to say the least. And we're working with a university in Palestine, or we had intended to work with a university in Palestine that was simply demanding an overhead of I don't know what, which wasn't funded by the Volkswagen Foundation. So in the end we also ended up working through an NGO.
Okay.
So it is very difficult, and I think institutionally it is becoming even more difficult by the year.
Right. Okay, so to conclude, I want to ask you about maybe another modern day controversy, and it has in some ways to do with studying items that are from a country that is now war-torn, but to be able to access them from somewhere like Europe. And this is the debate about ancient artifacts and where they really belong, whether, an artifact that's been stolen from Syria and is now in a British museum, whether that's how people should approach this debate, and whether a Syrian artifact that's been taken by the British and kept in a museum and under much safer conditions at the moment, if that's the right place for it, or whether politics aside, those artifacts should remain in the places from where they came.
I'm very glad I'm not an archaeologist or museum person, so I can really take the position of an semi-informed lay person.
Mm-hmm.
And that would probably be that, first of all, you have to look at the conditions under which the artifacts came here. I think there are some which were very clearly stolen. There are others which are very clearly gifts, or where there was a share of finds between different countries.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that makes it, these legal conditions might seem very tedious, but I think they make a difference. The second point is indeed that I've heard from many friends from places such as Yemen and Syria that, oh, I'm glad this stuff is in Berlin or in London or in Paris because it's much safer there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, thinking back at our own history of world wars, I'm not even sure about that. But there, I find it a very difficult question. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure I have a very clear answer. I think the kind of smuggling out of particular artifacts simply to have them here is something very dangerous because they are part of the heritage of a different region. I think what is perfectly legitimate is to make copies and take them or whatever. But if there's an agreement on these things, obviously. But I do find it ethically difficult. On the other hand, I am glad that quite a number of, let's say, Iraqi artifacts are still around, which might not be otherwise, or Syrian, where, for example, the IS has destroyed statues and images and so on. Yeah. So I think it's a very tricky one. Yeah. And I'm glad I don't have to answer it professionally.
Okay, well, Ulrike Freitag, it's been a fascinating conversation with you today. Thanks so much for being on History on Tape.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today on History on Tape. If you liked what you saw and want to see more, you can follow us on YouTube or Twitter at History on Tape.